but decidedly dour after long exposure to the weather. So Berwick isn't a seductive town. Charming? No. What it has got is character, strong character. And for two features, it is in England unique. Its fortifications and its bridges. How best to cross the broad Tweed opposite Berwick occupied men's minds for centuries. This used to be the site of an ancient ferry and low-water ford, older even than Berwick itself, and indeed one of the reasons why the town arose at this point. It was in the 12th century that the Tweed was first bridged here. Two replacements were required in the century that followed. The first two bridges were of timber, the third of stone. But it was to no avail. This is a river liable to tremendous flooding. In 1294, after a life of only 9 years, the stone bridge was swept away. In the Tudor period, another one was erected in timber, but its condition was frequently dangerous. In 1603, James I, journeying to London, strongly objected to it and decreed that another stone bridge must be erected. Well, here it is. It took 23 years to build and was finished in 1634. It's 1,064 feet long and has 15 arches. Both the arches and the intervening piers are of varying sizes. The channel here is at its deepest close to the Berwick shore. That explains the steep rise to the second arch, under which there had to be sufficient headroom for the smaller sailing boats. But to enjoy these bridges to the full, we must take to the water. The Berwickers, learning no doubt from experience, certainly made a sturdy job of their new bridge. Constructed of the local sandstone, it has stood here for 350 years, can still shoulder enormously heavy loads, and has never been carried away by floods. The Tweed Bridge, the next along, although the most recent, is already under repair. It's of naked concrete, and when it was built, it was the longest road bridge in Britain. It was started in 1925 on the Tweedmouth side, and it took 3 years to complete. Each of its arches was built on 4 ribs, and when the surrounding scaffolding was removed, these became clearly visible underneath. There were 4 arches altogether, and the last to be built had a span of 361 feet. In its day, easily the longest reinforced concrete arch in Britain. It's a very bold bridge, but alas, not elegant. Had it been built today, it would have been constructed on a different system. That is, as a monolith, instead of an assembly of parts. And the result would have been a much lighter structure, aesthetically more acceptable. And now, ahead of us, is one of the great thrills of English railway engineering, the Royal Border Bridge, with no fewer than 28 splendid arches. Rising 126 feet above the bed of the Tweed, this stately procession of round-headed arches suggests an obvious analogy with the aqueducts of imperial Rome. The piers are of stone, but the arches are of brick and only faced with stone. The brick is easily visible as we pass underneath. It was designed by Robert Stevenson in 1847 and opened by Queen Victoria in 1850. It was the final link in the East Coast Railway line from London to Edinburgh. "2,000 men helped to build it. It's easily the longest bridge of the three, 2,152 feet, or just over 2/5 of a mile. The way in which the piers taper adds considerably to the bridge's artistic appeal. But the real visual excitement comes from its long, sweeping curve. Of the 28 arches, 16 are on dry land, and only 12 actually cross the water. The central pier stands firmly on the southern bank. Towering over the lower reaches of the Tweed, this fine bridge is a noble monument to the railway age. But memorable as are the bridges, there's no other town in England that can compare with Berwick in the extent of its fortifications. The earliest of these is the castle, built by Edward I in 1297, during one of the spells when the town was in the hands of the English. It survived for several centuries, and as this engraving after Turner shows, it completely dominated the surrounding terrain. From the castle, a steep flight of steps, known locally as the Breaky Necks, descended to the water tower and jetty on the river bank. The remains of the Breaky Necks, still visible today, are protected on the outer side by a huge defence known as the White Wall. This was almost destroyed in 1720, when workmen wanted to reuse the stone for the construction of the new barracks, and were only halted at the 12th hour. The castle, though, sited as it was on top of the hill, right in the path of the advancing railway, was a good deal less fortunate. Considerable portions survived until the 1840s, when it was decided to site the station exactly here. The lines were driven slap through the middle of the Great Hall. Much the same thing occurred at Newcastle. Was this railway vandalism a Northumbrian speciality, I wonder? Apart from the remains of the castle and the White Wall, there isn't much to be seen now of the medieval fortifications. A number of other English towns can show a lot more. Even the octagonal bell tower, begun by Edward I, became obsolete when the Elizabethan walls were constructed to enclose a rather smaller area. The size and scale of the new fortifications are a sure indication that the English still did not feel secure. And about 1560, there was indeed a real danger of another invasion from Scotland, to be helped this time from France. So Queen Elizabeth decided to construct much stronger fortifications than had existed hitherto on an entirely new plan devised in Italy. The first place to use this new system was Lucca in Tuscany in 1505. Verona followed in 1523 and Antwerp in 1545. In England, there was and is nothing in the least like them. These walls run for nearly a mile and a half. They're 22 feet high, 12 feet thick at the base, and 10 feet at the top. Principally rubble, they are faced externally with ashlar stone, which was brought from the two big quarries, both long disused, on the cliffs nearby. But the particular strength of these walls lay in the design of the bastions. Instead of being semicircular or square, as they would have been in the Middle Ages, they project from the walls like giant arrowheads, with platforms on which guns were mounted, facing the attacker. Each bastion was connected to the main walls by a thick strip known as a collar, and the deep rectangular recesses formed between the walls, the collars and the bastions, were called flankers. They were also provided with guns, and these fired parallel with the main walls. These guns in the flankers, supplementing those actually on the bastions, ensured that every inch of the walls was enfiladed, that's to say, protected by sweeping fire. A little later, by bringing up great quantities of earth, the tops of the bastions were heightened to enable the main guns to have a longer and wider range, which accounts for the Chelsea bun effect evident here. The Elizabethan fortifications were never quite finished. With the accession of James I, they were no longer required. They became, in fact, a Brobdingnagian white elephant. In the 18th century, the walls became a fashionable promenade. And in case you preferred sitting to promenading, the Victorians thoughtfully added a number of cast-iron seats, supported by snakes. But Berwick still retained its military importance. It was a garrison town, full of soldiers, which the citizens didn't at all appreciate having billeted upon them. So they petitioned for the erection of a barracks, and between 1717 and 1721 this was done. These were the earliest barracks to be built in Britain, and there was accommodation for nearly 600 men. The basic material is brick. Over 1 million bricks were made, with clay brought from across the river. But all the buildings were faced with stone, local stone, some of it pillaged from the castle. Unluckily, parts of the side ranges were later cement rendered, so they are now much smoother than was originally intended. These barracks are often said to have been designed by Sir John Vanbrugh, the architect of Blenheim, but for this there is no documentary evidence. All that can be said is that he was in Northumberland at least once during the building period, and that the style is fairly like his. This is best seen in the gateway, with its touch of swagger and strong personality. Today, though, these vast barracks, empty since 1965 and with no obvious alternative use, present quite a problem for Berwick. Close to the barracks is a curious and unexpected building, the parish church. Unexpected because of its date. It was finished in 1652. Curious because of its architectural style. Very few churches were built during the Commonwealth, and this one has neither tower nor spire. The reason, so it's always said, is because Cromwell just didn't like bells. An embryonic version of the so-called Venetian window, which became so popular in Britain in the 18th century, is much in evidence. When Holy Trinity did acquire a set of bells, they had to be hung down the road in the tower of the town hall. This building is no masterpiece, but it is without doubt the most prominent in Berwick, and it's plumb in the centre of the walled town. It was erected in the 1750s, and its most attractive feature is without doubt its steeple. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, Berwick was just a poor garrison town. Its recovery began then, but proceeded only very slowly until the Act of Union of 1707. That was a landmark in the history of Berwick because it meant that normal trading relations with the Scottish hinterland could at last be resumed. Until then, most of the roofs that we see below us would have been of thatch. But by now, with increased prosperity, better roofing materials such as pan tiles have become available. So Berwick's thatch gradually disappeared. Pan tiles are normally a warm, dense red, and their wavy surface gives them a delightful richness of texture. They are indeed one of the most enjoyable sights of eastern and northeastern England. They are considerably bigger than the plain tiles found elsewhere, and they overlap both downwards and sideways, where the down-bent edge of one tile hooks over the upturned edge of its neighbour. They first arrived from Holland as ballast in ships at the beginning of the 18th century. Later they were made locally. Nowadays, Berwick has to get its pan tiles from Hull, usually involving very long delays. The other principal roofing material is slate, and several kinds were used. The most pleasing are the greyish-green Westmoreland slates, with which the town is well provided. Others, mostly of 19th century date, include very dark Scottish slate from Ballachulish and purplish Welsh slate from Portmarnock. And I'm told that there's even some from Norway, though from high above the town hall I can't actually see it. The town hall's octagonal cupola is a great feature of Berwick's skyline. It's just 150 feet to the gilded weather vane. but it does take some acrobatics to get up, and the descent is even more perilous. The top floor of the main building formerly housed the town jail. It was last used in 1922. Top security prisoners had their own cell, and so also did drunks. This was the women's cell. The window used to be barred. The bed had a straw mattress on which up to 4 women could sleep side by side. If there were more than 4, some had to sleep on the floor or take it in turns. The rougher characters might be confined in leg-irons. All safely tucked up for the night. But this was the grimmest place, the cell for those condemned to die. The last occupant was one Grace Griffin in 1823. Although protesting her innocence to the end, she was convicted of having murdered her husband and led off from here to the gallows on a hill just above the station. Justice, blindfolded as a symbol of the law's impartiality, presides over the pleasant Georgian room below that is now the council chamber. This excellent plaster relief would look far more effective were it seen against a background of Wedgwood blue, as it was originally. It was modelled in 1789 by Joseph Alexander. 36 years later, he received his fee, which was £5 precisely, without compound interest. A close-fisted place, Berwick, in those days. The completion of the town hall in 1761 marked the beginning of Berwick's most prosperous period. Like most of the buildings within the walls, it's of sandstone, which was brought from 2 quarries, New Mills and Edrington, 3 and 4 miles to the west. And we can see how the rustication of the stonework gives it a certain strength of personality. Standing as it does on an island site, which no doubt accounts for its somewhat pinched proportions, it has nevertheless commanded the High Street for over 200 years. In the century following its completion, the town was largely rebuilt, and this pleasing group of houses in Ravensdown, in a confident ashlar sandstone, reflects something of the sense of security and growing wealth. The town flourished at this time mainly because of its good natural harbour. Through here passed all the products of the fertile land of the Tweed basin: beef cattle, hides, eggs, butter, and plenty of fish, especially salmon. Above all, there was the handling of corn. And just behind the quay walls, we can still find huge 18th century granaries, covered nowadays in moss and lichen. By the beginning of the 19th century, Berwick was one of the chief ports in England for the shipment of grain. But with the arrival of the railway, the produce of the Tweed basin no longer had to travel by ship to find its markets. So, by 1875, the great days were over. Murray's Handbook for Travellers in Scotland of that year wrote with some justification, "The town is best seen from the railway and is not worth entering." For much of the present century, Berwick did undeniably look rather down at heel. Handsome houses could be treated with ruthless disrespect. The quayside in particular was in a very shabby state. But since 1971, a remarkable transformation has taken place. This house is one of a number which have recently been recovered from near dereliction by the local Preservation Trust. They've brought them back to life and done a wonderful job, and not before it was necessary either. The restoration is, as it should be, in the local sandstone ashlar. And what a contrast to the way this house looked only 10 years ago. Next door, they've renovated a fine cast lead fanlight inside the vestibule, and there's another outside. The sandstone on both these 18th century houses is once more clean, and therefore, predictably, pink. The entire surface of this stonework has been tooled. These tooled surfaces, in various patterns, are something of a Berwick speciality. Next door, we see another example, not the same pattern. Further along the quay walls is the custom house, a bit Adam-like in character. The restoration of the custom house, and the one 2 doors along, was government-sponsored. Here we see different tooling again. There are a number of tooled houses in Berwick. Indeed, I know of no other town which has so many. And freak of freaks, there's even one done in plaster. But here on the waterfront, the decorative effect is, I think, just right, and these restored buildings make quite a handsome group. Here, in an extremely exposed situation, and standing alone, facing east towards the sea, is within the walls the tallest house in Berwick and the most strikingly situated. It's called the Lions House, and it's another excellent example of sandstone ashlar. Here too, the stone isn't a bit dark. A few years ago, its condition became so bad that it was in danger of demolition. Then the local trust stepped in, and a couple of businessmen heroically undertook the restoration. Into the windows, the glazing bars were put back, to the building's immense benefit. But unhappily, it is necessary to add that some of the recent craftsmanship is, to say the least, unfortunate. Just look at this repointing. with the mortar splonged over the edges of the fine sandstone blocks like that. It's really most distressing. How can any man, with the example of the good pointing before his very eyes, botch his work like that? The lions on the gate piers seem equally puzzled about it. For sighting, the Lions House has only one rival, which is Wellington Terrace, a group of 3 houses looking nearly due south across the water. They are all faced with sandstone ashlar, but only the middle one has so far been cleaned. Now, there can be little doubt that usually the appearance of stone is much improved by cleaning. But in the case of a terrace, it really should be all or none, by mutual agreement between the owners. Each house here was intended to have its portico, but unfortunately the central one was later demolished, and that of the house on the right never got built. The door and portico of number 1 suggest how pleasant all 3 entrances could have looked. The Georgian windows here are just as they should be, and so, believe it or not, are the blank windows on the side wall. These are ornamental and intentional. Nothing, I might add, to do with the window tax. But what is incomprehensible is that anyone should think of reglazing Georgian windows in quite so inept a way as we see here. Still, the cast-iron railings are really quite good. This house, in Castlegate, is very similar to the middle house in Wellington Terrace, but hasn't yet been cleaned. How much better, though, than the balancing house at the other end of the terrace. The painting of the stonework here, with the rest of the long terrace unpainted, can only be described as architectural bad manners. Painting or colour washing a house makes a tremendous difference to it. Here are 2 that have been rendered and painted, with the dressings picked out in a darker shade. Duck egg blue for this one, and grey blue for that one. Where the masonry is good, to apply colour can be a very questionable practice aesthetically. But these 2 houses are undeniably most attractive. Berwick has plenty of other examples, not all equally successful. Here are a few, by an odd coincidence, all hotels. The Bridge Hotel has some sandstone rubble exposed on the side wall, but the front has been stuccoed and given a livery of white and grey-brown. I find this delightful. The glazing bars are complete in all the windows, and with the tetra-style portico, all that means is 4 columns across, and its pretty doorcase flanked by niches, as well as the old railings and steps, this building, which not many years ago was smothered in ivy, seems to me to be a model of good restoration. It is, in truth, about the only building of distinction in Tweed on the other side of the river. facing across the old bridge. So, bravo for the Twempes, as the people of Tweedmouth are called by the Berwickers. Berwick is also one of those places which has responded to the encouragement offered by the HBC, that's the Historic Buildings Council of England, to set up what's called a town scheme. Under this, any sums allocated by the local authorities, maybe with help from their county council, are doubled by the Department of the Environment. Berwick has a number of buildings which have received this kind of assistance. In this way, an incentive is offered to owners of residential and commercial property to invest in their own towns, and to local authorities to become committed to programs of repairs. Even items such as street lamps haven't been overlooked. These were a contribution to European Architectural Heritage Year, 1976. It has been recognized that for much of its future prosperity, Berwick has now to look to tourism. And as we've seen, both the town and the environs have much to offer. Berwick is small and not at all rich, and with so many old buildings, not with any obvious use today, preservation here is a daunting undertaking. All honour, then, to this sturdy little town for having taken up the challenge so gallantly.